Yo, 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 what is up, pilots across the world? Welcome back to your weekly dose of awesomeness here at Paragliding Atlas. In case you're new here, I'm your host Aninder Singh, and in case you haven't done so already, go do me a favor and smash that like and subscribe button and drop me a rating wherever possible, because simply that is the most efficient way we can force the algorithms to bring this awesomeness of all things paragliding to more pilots out there and eventually make the skies a better place to be. And as you might have noticed, we are releasing this episode a bit ahead of schedule, and the reason for that is we have so much amazing content lined up and coming your way that we simply do not have time to stagger it out for later releases. But with that being said, the only catch is that we have enough internet to actually make it happen, because we are traveling to some really amazing places on the planet Earth. And I'm not going to spill all the beans here, so as I always say, stay tuned, stay excited, because the magic is just getting started. Anyways, as amazing as it sounds, only time will tell how much of that we are able to manage. But for now, let's focus on today's episode. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and everyone along with them? It's once again time to bring back the man, the myth, and one of the very own of the OG tribe that were the first ones who more or less invented the art of what we know today as Biv Adventuring. And this time around, he's sharing much more than just navigating the skies. And with that, I mean that he's sharing some of the most amazing stories and memories that he has managed to create with over 3 decades of flying while exploring the world from above, hanging under a humble aircraft called paraglider. And that too with some of the most pioneering pilots that our sport has seen from back in the day. But yeah, enough of hyping this up for now. I would say you guys are smart enough to know where to put in your effort to find out what I'm talking about. So for now, let's dive right in, and I hope you like it. Eddie Colfox, what an absolute honor to see you second time on the show, sir. Welcome to Paragliding Atlas one more time.
It's a pleasure to be here again. It's nice to talk to you again, Ananda. That was my luck. I'm just older than you.
Older, wiser, and more experienced, I think. Let me add on to that one.
Yeah.
Fair enough, Eddie. This time around, we are joining in for a very special topic, which is the topic of storytellers. And I believe somebody with your experience who has seen the sport evolve and thrive and survive through various dynamics during the past years. Tell us a little bit about what our audiences are in for, and what does 3 decades of experience bring in from your end today?
I was born in 1969, makes me 56 years old now, and I just love the idea of flying. I was massively influenced by all the hang gliding on TV in the 70s when it first came out, and then I had a cousin that did it, and I was just determined to do it as soon as I could. But that took a while, because I first viewed it when I was like 15 or 13. And then I had a cousin that died hang gliding. So my family weren't keen on letting me do it for a little while. I had to wait until I was independently able to get to places.
Sorry for your loss, Eddie. It's quite a tricky thing to navigate in this sport.
It wasn't good. That's the wrong word to use. But it was an early introduction to the fact that although it looked really exciting and fun, that it was very real and there was danger.
Fair enough, Eddie. But just for the perspective of audiences, I think the write-up that you shared, you had quite detailed description of Ross Somerville and your first paragliding flight. Let's dive right into it. How did the art of flight entice you, and how did you get into this?
My first paragliding flight was after 3 years of wanting to learn to hang glide. At the time, I was working on ships, and it was difficult to get it together because I couldn't carry it around, and the schools were all in different parts of the country, and I was hardly ever on leave. I was hardly ever in the UK. But in so doing with the hang gliding, I'd met this guy, Ross, who was a good mate of a good mate, and one of the very early proponents of paragliding. I wasn't there at its inception. I started in 92, I think, 91, 92. But Ross had on something called a hot dream. He'd had a hot dream flight where he didn't accidentally engaged with sea breeze convergence. He'd done a 98-kilometer flight way back in 1989 or 1990, I believe. I have to check the stats somewhere. And then, so I was in the UK and Ross came to visit and we went for a walk. He insisted on bringing this strange nylon bag with him, this little bag. And he insisted on walking up a particular hill. I thought that was normal because he was a hang glider pilot and I was a keen but hardly flowing hang glider pilot. And we wandered up this hill, coincidentally, of course, yeah, was facing into wind. And then he started to get this. He let me in on the trick. He said, "This is a paraglider and this is what I've achieved." We had a lot of fun being dragged through cowpats on top of the hill, ground handling it for a bit. It was quite windy because we were getting dragged through cowpats. And then he bunged me off the hill. That was my first flight. I flew in a straight line for quite a long time and landed. It was a big adventure, but I wasn't completely green. I'd done a little bit of hang gliding and we did spend 10, 15 minutes being dragged through cowpats before I got bunged off the hill.
Thank you for your honesty, Eddie. A lot of us go through our own adventures when we learn to ground handle. But Eddie, just for perspective, how did the free flight scenario look at that time? Was hang gliding ruling the scene up to a point where it was easy enough to someone to just be curious about it and there were providers out there? Or did people had to really dig in and find the right person and get in the community and get the trust? What was it like if you wanted to fly back in the day?
You had to dig in and go and give it a go. You had to be prepared to get in the car and drive to places. But then there were schools in the UK. There were many more hang gliding schools than there currently are, but there still weren't very many. There was one in Dartmoor. And in my early days of paragliding, I had to go all the way to Derbyshire or Wales to get it together. But I was very fortunate in that within a year of trying paragliding, a chap called Andrew Pearce, who's a great mate, he'd come from, there was also a school on the Isle of Wight, High Adventure, and Andrew had been working for High Adventure, which was part of Airwave, which was the precursor of Ozone, and that half the team of Airwave ended up starting up Ozone. And Andrew was part of that crowd, and he came, started a school, Flying Frenzy, and I was its first student, although I'd done a little bit prior to meeting him. And Andrew and I, we're both farmers' sons from this part of the country, West Dorset on the south coast of the UK. And under Andrew's guidance, and Andrew set up Flying Frenzy as a student and a co-farmer. We managed to get some permissions locally, and it was great. He took me through my first year or so of properly learning to fly. I scared and witless because I was full of young, dumb, and full of cum, or whatever, however they said in the UK. I was very enthusiastic. I got picked out of many bushes and small trees. He kept me safe and taught me a huge amount. He and I have had a long flying relationship, which we still do. I ended up being involved in running the school and working. I became an instructor very early on in my paragliding. Of course, one needs to work to be able to spend lots of time doing something. You either need to find the money and leisure time or you live the job, and that's what I chose to do. I became a paragliding bum. I did a little bit of instruction and all the British comps and met some wonderful people. That's when I first met John Silvester, who I imagine 90% of people on this podcast will know of him. If not, look him up, because he was the first very visible Vol Biv pilot. There's a fantastic film, From Nowhere to the Middle of Nowhere, that was made in the first year I went to India, I believe. I think it was made in 94 or 5. Where he and this guy Alan Hughes did this massive flight from Dharamsala to most of the way to Nepal. Not one flight, of course, and a number of flights camping out. They did it on tandem. And so, in my opinion, it's the best paragliding movie of all time because it shows the general public what it's like, because Alan Hughes's face just reflects all the fear and excitement of all your first flights, but he's doing this massive vol biv across a lot of the Himalayan range.
I've seen that video multiple times, and one thing that blows my mind is that back in the day when GoPros and action cameras were a distant dream, just figuring out how to stay in the air longer than planned or finding the appropriate clothing and the safety mechanisms along with it were quite a challenge. And then these guys go out there with the camera, record all of that and edit it and put it out in one of the most enriching storytelling manners I've seen. So I think we'll put a link to that video in the show notes.
And also the Birdman and the Karakoram one, which was a later one that I was involved in, that was still using fairly big cameras. I made
Masterpieces.
This extraordinary one. It was really just a fun thing because the first time I went to Hunza in Pakistan, I got given this massive camera that I just couldn't put anywhere because it was so big. I couldn't attach it up in the lines. It would have killed me. And so I ended up just having it between my legs. And consequently, it got a dirty lens and everything. But it was just, yeah, as you say, extraordinary to be able to use that tech in those sorts of demanding conditions. But Alan had come from a kayaking and a climbing filmmaking background. He'd made some amazing films. Stone Monkey is a fantastic film that he made, and I can't remember the names of the other ones, but look him up. Alan, Alun Hughes, Hughes. Some extraordinary stuff that he made. He's an old man now. He's in his 70s. So yeah, people have been doing amazing things for ages.
Absolutely. And that is the reason why a pioneer pilot like you and everybody else that you shared the airspace with can inspire the next generation with your stories. But take me back in time, Eddie. How was the visualization like? How did you see that the sport would grow? Because let's say when you were just getting the early hours under the wing, when cross-country wasn't even a thing invented or something that people would plan out, what was the definition of having fun with a paraglider look like?
It's not true to say no one had gone cross-country because, as I just said, Ross had done this amazing flight and people had been doing small flights. Ross held that record for ages because it was a lucky break that he went quite so far. People were doing 20, 30, 50-kilometre flights in the UK at that time, and overseas it was greater. I can't remember what there was a Namibian record at that time. That was the world record, and I can't remember the numbers. I'm sorry, but it was over 100. It was quite a long way. It was possibly over 200 even then.
And what kind of glide ratios were the wings?
The top wings, I'm trying to remember what the top wing was. I think it was about 7, 6.5. Training wings were less than that. By about 95, you were getting things like the Nova Xenon. I may be wrong with my numbers, but some proper tech head will get in touch with you and say, Eddie got it slightly wrong. Roughly the early to mid 90s, the Nova Xenon came out, and that was definitely a game changer in my early years. But just as I was around, there was the Airwave Black Magic. That was just as I arrived in the sport. And there were some groundbreaking flights. The world record out and return was set in beer by a French guy called Xavier Ramond, in a competition that I think was 1989.
Fair enough. Going out and chasing adventure, was it basically about, like, were people actually taking all of these pilgrimages or travels specifically for cross-country? Or was it more or less that they were still experimenting with the equipment and figuring out how to get the know-how of it?
Cross-country was an aspiration of only a few members of the club, I think is the way to answer this. Most people were very content just to soar up and down on whichever ridge they were on. But people were definitely going cross-country, but it was only a handful in the club. Nowadays, of course, at least half the British clubs are expecting to go cross-country. The people now in their first couple of years do. The ones that are as keen as I was are probably doing 100k flights. The equipment has definitely vastly improved. And it's safer. That's the thing. A comp wing back then was a really scary. You'd expect the comps that I was doing back then, you'd expect to have massive collapses. You'd expect to be turned on every good day. You'd go chasing, if you were chasing the lead gaggle or part of the lead gaggle, you'd see someone go into a thermal, you'd see half their wing fold up, you'd see them correct it, and that's where you'd go. That's where the good stuff was.
Love it. The mayhem, as we all know, cloud-based mayhem.
The same stuff would happen to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad there were like the bunch of people who believed in this madness and still made the most out of it, regardless of how many challenges it came. But how did the acro scene look like, Eddie? Was it just the wingovers, or were people doing a bit more than that? Or were there
It,
anything at all?
it was, I think, on purpose, just the wingovers. The
Fair
cue
enough.
thing being on purpose.
All right, because acro came in fairly later on in the industry, but spiral dives, wingovers, these have been two of the basic maneuvers which have stayed since the inception of paraglider.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, spiral dives and wingovers we would do those, and then the beeline stall was quite common, and various other maneuvers to descend. But giving names to all the acro maneuvers was definitely not around. You weren't doing them in control. I'm quite glad that acro wasn't finessed in my early days, because I might have tried too hard in that too.
I'm sure a lot of pilots in the audience can resonate, because everybody loves pushing their limits when they're. I don't know. Is this testosterone thing, or is it like just whatever you said, young, dumb, and whatever thing? That people just love doing something out of their comfort zone. It resonates with the saying that there are bold pilots and old pilots, but no bold and old pilots, which doesn't make complete sense to me. But why do people slow down? Is it just the age or nature, or is it actually something more to it? I think this is a deep question that I've just asked you.
That's a tricky question, because I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not sure that we all slow down as such.
Right.
I've always, not always, that's not true. I had one proper accident in paragliding. I've landed in trees and things like that, but it's not true to say I've had one proper one. I've had one where I've hurt myself significantly, although it was only a day or two in hospital, and it's not been life-altering, so I'm very lucky. And that was entirely my fault. It was in my first 2 or 3 years of flying, when I was doing really well. I was winning the National League at the time, and I was properly competitive. I couldn't understand why all these older hang glider pilots, in my opinion at the time, were miserable. They were killjoys. They were always saying, oh, it's too strong, it's too this, it's too the other. And I'd had a crazy day doing crazy stuff inland. It was very unstable. I don't really want to repeat it I don't mind repeating it online if other people learn from it, because I think it's really important to be brave and bold and say where you messed up. And so I messed up. I was arrogant as hell. I launched there were QNIM clouds. I didn't get sucked up really high in one, but I'd got in very severely rained on. I was really rough. Anyway, and I managed to land in a sort of small gust front. So I'd had a very adventurous day. And then I bundled all my wet gear into the back of my car, trying to dry it out. And I thought, hang on, it's sea breezing, because it was that kind of unstable day on the south coast of the UK where it's sea breezes. And I thought, great, I can go to the coast and I can dry my wing out and just soar around with a wet wing, which isn't, of course, advised. That was my thinking. And I got to the coast, and the first thing to the launch, and it was gusting, but it didn't seem too windy. I was really excited. I hardly assessed the weather. And I just bunged my wing out, set up in seconds. This guy I knew quite liked, but I always didn't hang on, you're a killjoy, old hangy pilot chap. Came up, Eddie, it's too windy. And I ignored him. And I pulled the glider up, and as I turned round, there was a gust front. There was a school line in the water, and I didn't bring the glider down. I got lifted up, and then I got a massive collapse on launch and managed to stop the glider turning severely, but I basically stalled it in from not terribly high onto a slope and compressed some vertebrae. And so there you go. Your question is, why do people lose why do people become less reckless as they go older? There are no old and bold pilots, because I'm an old and bold pilot, but I'm less bold than I used to be. I thought I knew it all back then, and I crashed. I've been flying for over 30 years, and I don't know it all. I'm learning all the time. I learn off pilots with huge experience, more experience than myself, and I learn off pilots who are just starting out. A lot of it is psychology, and a lot of it's skill. But your skill is useless if you have bad psychology, because it's the psychology that will kill you. It's always the fault of the human, really. There's always a decision. there's a bad decision that puts you in danger, and then there's usually 2 or 3 more bad decisions that you make, and then you eventually hurt yourself. You've got to learn to make the good decisions.
Golden words, Eddie. I love the way you put it in the last sentence, that life will give you a few chances before finally getting angrier at you. And I think somebody told me this, that every time the cost of lesson learned becomes heavier, the price that you pay becomes heavier, and you have to learn when to finally be real to yourself and make sure that you know when to push back instead of just keeping on.
That's an interesting thing, which was I deliberately withdrew from comps at one stage because I didn't like being told what to do. I didn't want to fly a task on some of the days. I didn't want to fly that particular task. I thought it was scary, and I'm competitive. I like to win. I like to do well. And I got scared doing the wrong. I don't blame the task setters. It's impossible, a really difficult job. So occasionally the task setters would choose a task and the weather would be wrong for that particular day, and you'd end up anyway. It was really scary occasionally. Yeah. The other thing is that I've become slightly less of an adventure pilot than I used to be. We were the first people to fly in Hunza and things like that. I did some 180 kilometer out and return there in 2004 and did some 7,800 meter heights and things like that. And I'm not that interested in doing that kind of thing so much anymore. Or I am. I love it. But the guiding and the tandems are a great way. It is an adrenaline sport, and to get the same adrenaline, you have to keep pushing your personal edge. I'm not that keen on doing that anymore because I'm mortal. I'm very mortal, and I'm very much in love with my life, the things I do and the people that are in it. So I'm keen to do those adventures, but I won't push it to the same degree. I'll fly away from a top landing, or I'll fly away from a cold because I'm too scared. When I started, I had a great degree of ignorance, so I didn't see the risks that are over the corner. Now I know more about the risks that are around the corner, and I'm just more cautious with it. I've discovered a way to enjoy it doing guiding and tandems. Usually I'm guiding people with considerably less experience than me, or I'm flying tandem pilots, and usually it's their first flight. And each time I parasitically or vicariously experience their thrill. So I'm throwing myself back to being a less experienced pilot and gaining that buzz that they're having. It's great.
I think that's a great way for an instructor or a guide to put themselves in, where you try and look at the task from your client's eyes, which are less experienced, as you said, and then you basically find the ways to make it fun within their limits.
Yeah, I didn't make that very clear. Thank you very much for editing that in that way. Obviously, you don't want to scare the wits out of your customer or your client. Yeah, but you can have a great parasitic vicarious thrill by doing something well within your own limits and within theirs.
Just out of curiosity, Eddie, how many hours do you have in total?
I have less than some people and more than most. I'm sorry to be vague about that. I'm not that great at all my record keeping, but I don't know the exact answer, but it's probably 6,000 hours. I'm slightly reluctant to put that out there, but if you've been flying for 30 odd years, and let's say just over that time, you've averaged well over 100 hours, I've got at least 3,000 on that basis. And many of those years I've flown 300 or 400 hours.
Fair enough. I don't want to put you in a spot here, but
so I'm doing a guesstimate. I've got somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 hours.
What blows me about the numbers thousands is that in commercial aviation, thousands of hours come fairly quickly, and the effort required is very different. You just sit in a cockpit, you have a very set flight plan, and then you just rake up hours, like 10 hours every flight or 5 hours every flight or something. If you treat it as a work, you pretty much rake up hours in 3-4 years. But in paragliding, on the other hand, hours is a whole different game.
Yeah. And back in the day, I've got my first logbook, and my first logbook has got loads of flights of 1 minute in it. And it's got a few of 15, 20, 30 minutes, and that's coastal soaring flights. And that's the difference. Nowadays, I don't know, if you live in the right country, you can get 150 hours in your first year.
Indeed.
Anyone with over 100 hours back in the 90s was a rock star.
Wow. Help us understand a little bit about the manufacturing side of it, Eddie, the brands and the equipment back in the day, because hang gliding was an established industry where people were ready to invest money and it made sense for the manufacturers. But paragliding, of course, there were only few pioneer pilots like you and your tribe who were going out and chasing big adventures with these massive cameras. How was the availability of trustworthy gear? And how was the support from the gear manufacturers for pilots like you who were out there making the most out of it and spreading the good word?
In the properly early days, just before, you could get wings off manufacturers for trips relatively easily, and they were massively supportive. Companies like Nova were very generous with our first Hunza trips. Manufacturers are keen to help if you've got a good story, but I think it's harder nowadays to get good assistance. I did get some sponsorship. Firebird were very generous to me. Nova were very generous to me. Gin were very generous to me. They were very supportive. They still are. And there's it's so much easier, I think, nowadays to get really big exposure with all the filmmaking abilities and the internet, with the social network. There's a lot you can give back to a manufacturer. You've got to be able to give something back.
So back in the day when you guys were chasing all the adventures, what was the usual trick to give back to the companies in return?
To give back was stories in magazines, winning competitions, gaining records. Those were the main ways. You had to be super organized to do that. You had to be well written as well. I wasn't too great at that kind of thing. I was an adventurer. If you were super good, there were many more professional pilots employed by manufacturers as opposed to guiding or teaching.
I'll tell you the reason why I'm asking this question. That is because often we have seen camera is a bit of a safety hazard and people are ready to push the safety limits to get the perfect shot. Today, it's a GoPro or an Insta360, which is on a stick, and people like to put out the most amazing content or the most viral-worthy content. Back in the days, you guys were traveling with cameras which were as big as the size of a laptop, which was, again, a safety hazard. So my curiosity stemmed from the fact that has the way of taking risk changed over the years when it comes to creating value for somebody who is paying you for it, or has it been pretty much the same way people have navigated this, but just that goods have changed and toys have changed, but the human psyche is still the same around it?
I think we've got to be real about this. Paragliding attracts risk takers. We've always been risk takers. And also, it attracts people who either it's compulsive enough that you want to make it your life, and to make it your life, you have to seek a way of funding it. And funding it means making films. So you'll take those risks. Nowadays, everyone's doing it. I never have a camera. I never have a little camera on my head. And I'd never put a big camera on my head, even if it was possible, because I'm from the school of paragliding where my early comp wings, I'd expect the wing to collapse. That might remove my helmet. I was at a British paragliding competition where it came on the radio. I've had a big collapse. It ripped my helmet off, but I'm still flying around. I'm trying to get this turn point. This was Guy Anderson. It came on a radio. So, yeah, the collapses were taking people's helmets off back then quite,
Did it not snap people's necks? That is the first thing that comes to my mind. If it catches a line of your camera, it's straight away going to impact on your neck instantly as soon as it reopens.
Yeah. I haven't heard of that actually happening, but there have been some inexplicable accidents, haven't there, where people have crashed and it's suspected that the lines have got caught up on a camera. I don't know whether that's actually been proven. You might be able to correct me on that, but it doesn't make good sense to me to fly with a helmet cam. I wonder if there's an opportunity for someone to use what those printers called. Those printers where you can print solid objects, and maybe design some that went underneath the average hero cam, the average GoPro or Instagram or whatever you call them. I'm not a tech head, as you can tell, but you can get those printers that make solid objects. I imagine there's an opening there for someone to sell that sort of thing through social networks.
While we are talking about chasing adventures, Eddie, Hunza and Beer and all of these were, of course, pretty amazing sites. But how did the thought of sharing it with others come back in the day? And if you can talk to our listeners about how did that aspect grow and develop into something so meaningful that eventually the whole camaraderie between you and everyone else involved was able to be spread over to a larger audience, to whosoever was willing to be a part of it?
I was lucky in some respects. I was focusing on being an adventure pilot up until about 2006 or so. I'd done lots of trips to Pakistan, lots of trips to India. I'd been working in Pune. I'd met this wonderful guy called Richard Jones. He'd been an adventure businessman in paragliding in India. He'd been teaching the Pune ashram paragliding, and he'd been doing lots of stuff in Goa, getting people high on a line. He'd had a tow syndicate in South Anjuna. He turned up one day when I was in Wales, and he turned up on the hill and he wanted to buy a load of tandems, and then he also said, "Do you want a job out there? Come and join me." And it was the end of the summer in Wales. The end of the summer in Wales, if you're a paraglider pilot, is quite a depressing place to be. It's a fantastic place to fly in the summer when the weather is great, but it's a very wet part of the country here in the UK. And so I jumped at it. I went out there and I ended up doing 2 winter seasons in both Pune and Goa. And that got me into India. I hadn't been very familiar with India prior to that at all. I'd never been there. I knew some Indian people, but I hadn't been there. I loved both the people and the country. So I made it a point of going back as often as I could. And one of those times I went with John Silvester to Nanda Devi in 2005 when I was working with Brinkley. I met up with Debbie Chowdhury, who's a paragliding god in both India and France and elsewhere. Fantastic guy, multilingual, very generous with his knowledge and massively able as a pilot. And he was only a youngster. He was like 15, 16 then. He just started out in flying. And then Bruce Mills, he's another legend from Beer. He was really the first Westerner to be there and in the paragliding world. And so I met those guys early on. And then in 2006, I went to Nanda Devi with John. We had a really exciting time, but it was too exciting for me. We were landing in gorges and having to climb out, and I'm not a great climber. It was properly scary. John was doing some fantastic, very short flights. Each one of them was at huge risk to oneself, and I'd had enough of that. It wasn't what I wanted, and I wasn't a great climber as well. So I was putting myself in even more risk. I couldn't climb out of these places. I didn't have the skills or experience to do that. I was quite an experienced paraglider pilot, but I was a very bad climber. So I chickened out. We had a discussion. John stayed on for a bit, but I got on a bus and I went to Beer to meet up with my old friends. I'd only been to Beer one time before that, and it wasn't in the flying season and I hadn't flown. And I wanted to go out there. It was a perfect time to go. John was there, Debbie was there, Bruce was there, and loads of people like Mike were there. Antoine, I think, was there, and all the loads of the old beer heads were there. It was fantastic. Gilles Monnier, who I'd originally met down in Pune as well, he was there. We flew to Kulu on my second day there with Jim, and it was super exciting. Since then, I just kept on coming back, and I met up with all these guys. I think your original question is, how did it develop? It developed because of Beer's wonderful season. It's a short season, which is a pain, but it's one of its great things because it means everyone is there and you meet them all together. Everyone who loves it so and can has got a flexible enough life that they can. They're all there for that season, and it's such so. It's one of the best places to fly for people who are interested in Vol Biv. It's a fantastic place. Apart from, with respect to the Indians and the huge amount of development that they have, good development that they have achieved, the only downside is you've got to be real. It's a developing country, and consequently the emergent and a vast country with huge, with difficult terrain. So the rescue services aren't that great. But apart from that, it's the best place that I know of to fly internationally for those months. A lot of the best people are there. And they're cool. We've known each other for years. If people over a long period of time, and each time you see them, you're having an adventure, then it creates that kind of camaraderie. Landing on top of a mountainside and camping the night and spending it there with friends. It's heaven in a way. It's one form of heaven.
Indeed. And my curiosity stemmed from the fact that all of you guys out there were pretty much chasing it yourself, and then it was you to try and spread that. I think you guys must have been the first ones to offer tours in that region, no?
Yeah, I think we weren't the first commercial people out there, but I think we were the first people to do genuine safaris, go and fly, spend nights on the mountain. We weren't the first people to fly to Manali, although I think Debu was. Debu and Andy, I believe, were the first people to do that. But we made it more common. We introduced it to people rather than it just being the great pilots, the bold, good pilots. It then became something that was achievable by less bold, but good pilots. You had to be good to go. We would guide people conscientiously and try to assess people's genuine skill, maybe bolster their courage a little bit by being there to assist. That was a great thing to do. We did that every year from 2006. Yeah, we've taken many people.
Wow, sounds like quite an adventure. But while we're talking about adventure, Eddie, John Silvester is a name that comes up repeatedly when it comes to big mountain flying. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about John? How was he like, and how was he able to pioneer and push the limits and still stay safe and live to tell the tale? Because there are pilots who follow his ideology in today's world as well, but he was doing it when nobody else was.
To talk about John, it's lovely because he was a very special man and a fantastic friend to me and an inspiration. He was a brilliant pilot. That's the first thing to say. He was a very dedicated person. He put huge energy into the things he loved. He came from a dangerous sports background. He was a top climber before, so he was aware of risk. He made his own risk assessments. He was very responsible about other people. I had to persuade him to guide, not because he didn't think he was good enough. He just thought it because he recognized the responsibility of the role. So he was a very kind man and not rash and not arrogant with the skills that he had. And he had a classic laugh. He was, in different circles, he was known as the crow or the vulture because he was tall and lean and broad-shouldered. So he had that kind of look on the ground with these broad shoulders. When he was standing there, he had that, and he had a narrow face, so he'd look quite Quilline anyway. And then in the air, he'd fly like a crow. He'd do these jerky movements. He had a unique flying style. He could turn it flat in tiny bits of stronger cores. He was remarkable. I always thought it was a good day. It was a special day and quite a rare day when I flew better than him. I was so competitive back then. He must have found me incredibly annoying, like a crow hassling a vulture. But he was both those creatures, and I was some fat, lazy seagull. So, yeah, you can tell from that I held John in huge esteem. He didn't have other jobs that sustained him in paragliding. He lived on a shoestring and paraglided as much as he possibly could in adventurous areas. He treated it very professionally and flew incredibly well.
During his time in flying, I think you must have been one of the closest persons to share the airspace with him. Did he reach any roadblocks or any obstacles, be it mentally or physically, that he found difficult to overcome? And if yes, then what was his way of making the most out of any adverse situation?
It's quite difficult for me to answer that question for him. Yeah, he was like the rest of us. He was mortal, and he would. How did he? There was one great adventure flight that me and John and Jim, Mike Blubb, and who else was there? I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. We set off to fly to Bengal. Bengal was a dream place to fly. No one had flown there, and very few even have now. What they have, they've all landed up high in the Bengal Valley. We were planning on landing down by the village. We took off and we got to the watershed dividing the Bengal with Lahadi. And the day it was an inverted day. One of the problems with guiding is you tend to do all the guiding in the best part of the season, and then it gets more and more inverted as the season goes on. And that tends to be the time you can get out there with your mates because you're not busy with your clients. And anyway, we got stymied by that and had to try and break this inversion. All of us, many thousand super experienced pilots, and we were bashing around on this inversion, not managing to break through it, maybe 50 meters below the watershed. And some of us were getting up to literally 4 or 5 meters below the spine that we needed to go over the back. And I just couldn't do it. And John did. And then he managed, and he was the one and the only one of us who managed to, and he landed down over there. But had a great time. And then you're also asking me how he overcame physical issues. The reason why he got into paragliding in the first place was actually because of a physical issue. He'd been climbing so much. He approached climbing in much the same way as he approached paragliding. He was super determined. And as a result, he'd had lots of falls and his ankles were in a really bad way. They were shocking to look at. They were massive. I don't know how many times he'd broken his ankles. Consequently, a long walk was always a problem. And that was another way he was so good, because he'd also launch really low because he couldn't walk. He could walk up the top, but it was very painful for him. And he would walk up the top if he had to, but if he thought there was a chance of climbing out lower down, he'd launch from lower down and climb out, which is not necessarily a recommended thing, guys listening, because you don't know what the wind's going to be doing higher up. But someone with John's skill and experience often launch low down and climb out. So that's how he overcame a physical ability, and he was just a bit better and a bit more determined. And I think a good pilot is always someone who works out his risk management strategy and flies within it. If you end up flying outside your risk management strategy, even if it pays off, you're not necessarily a good pilot. You're just a lucky one, because a good pilot should stay within his risk management strategy, certainly if he's a tandem pilot anyway. But he was a comp pilot, so he'd come from that comping background where it was all about achieving the goal. That's a big difference from me. I didn't do that much comping. I was always taught in paragliding, be prepared to abandon the goal if it's putting you at risk. That's the one I maintain, to be honest, because to me, winning is staying alive and experiencing a good life. It's not necessarily winning the paragliding competition.
Wise words, Eddie. Wise words. I think if everybody else can resonate to this, that winning in life is more important than winning it in a flight or in a paragliding competition. It's a very enriching way to make sure you make most of not only the day, but also the days to come. And Eddie, you have explored and seen the sport, not exactly from the beginning, but fairly early on. And some of the biggest technical revolutions have happened in your lifespan. So what is next in paragliding according to you?
Oh, gosh. What is next? This lightweight, small package thing, the hike and fly thing, will develop a lot more. The versatility of that, of being able to go for walks and enjoy it. It's interesting, when I talk to my son's 22 and he's been around paragliding all his life, he thinks that the younger scene's much more interesting to him, and that's not comping, not cross country as such. He enjoys it. He's done a bit of it. He's more the acro and the hike and fly. That's the way he sees it. Maybe some military applications, but that's probably going on and we just don't know about it. I know that commercially they use them for dropping equipment, but the actual sport, I think acro and hike and fly are probably the big expanding areas. The cross country thing won't get. Just more people will be doing it. More people within the sport will be doing it. But whether the sport grows, that discipline itself grows, I don't know.
Indeed, I think
What did the manufacturers say, incidentally? I'm hoping.
most of them are just putting their word where the money is, and understandably so, because even though the sport does seem to be quite expensive for the consumers, the manufacturers also complain that they don't make enough money. So this is more or less like a catch-22. Like, who is making money? Is it the big factories who make for different brands, or is it the raw material suppliers, or is it the ones who are in the middle? Because consumers are definitely paying quite a premium, and majority of the manufacturers are seeing a lot of good sales in the mid B section, which is capable of doing fair bit of introductory acro and does check off quite a list of boxes when it comes to chasing cross country, but at the same time is also decent for hike and fly. So I think your answer does resonate. But the only concern is that it is being done on equipment which runs out quickly, like consumer ship economy, where you keep on buying new stuff every now and then and burning money because wings made for hike and fly don't last as long. But more or less, to answer the question, I think it is hike and fly and acro, or a little bit of more dynamic wings, such as the parakites and speed wings, if I have to narrow it down.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Of course, the C and D and comp wings are always going to have a smaller market, because certainly in the UK, paragliding takes up a lot of time. Most pilots don't do it for more than, I don't know, 6 or 8 years. The job, the wife, the children, real life or whatever. For many people, those of us who are lucky enough, you have to make a choice how you spend your life. Paragliding is a fantastic thing to do, but it takes up to get to a great level and to maintain it safely takes a long time. So to have a market for those higher rated wings, there's going to be less people that can get to that level and stay at that level and regularly fly at that level. Of course, the lower rated wings will do much better because they suit both a pilot that is only occasional but has been doing it for many years, and they suit the younger, keener, when I say younger in terms of pilot, the guy that's doing it, the guy and the girls that are doing it with all that enthusiasm of gaining your first 1,000 or so hours. Because I was completely compulsive for those times. For me, the paragliding in the air hasn't been the most dangerous thing, actually. Jokingly and seriously, I was more risk on the road on a good day than I would have been in the sky, because I would find it so difficult to drive a car without staring at the bloody sky. That degree of addiction.
Oh, geez, you put it very beautifully, Eddie. You're not alone in this one, man. We all do feel the same challenges on a good day. Funny. But I think that this sport's not going to go away. Because of that addiction, that enthusiasm, the manufacturers of it too. That's why they've gone into this difficult and risky industry. I know the Ozone team quite well, and they love it. They're not going to give up. And I'm sure that's true all the manufacturers, particularly the smaller manufacturers, because they're the guys having the rougher ride. Definitely very enthusiastic. I'm so glad you mentioned Ozone. I wanted to talk a little bit about Ozone because I think, were they starting after you guys started paragliding, or were they before you got in the sport?
No, they started up. The business itself started after I started paragliding. We were at a British competition in the Lake District, and Ozone will correct me, but I think it was probably 96 when they started.
Tell us a little bit about Ozone. How did the early days look of one of the grandest brand in the history of paragliding? That is what I'm curious about from an industry outsider, because obviously I can talk to a lot of people who are paid and on the payroll of Ozone who would love to bring in their insights, but from a spectator's point of view, who has seen the brand from its inception to what it is now.
As far as I'm aware, this Lake District competition that I was at, there was quite a lot of chat between Mike Kavanagh, Dave Pilkington, Steve Senior, Russell Ogden, Bruce Goldsmith, Matt, Robbie Whittle, and Mark Taggart. They were all there at this comp. There was a lot of chit-chat going on, and Ozone was born. Half those guys were previously employed by Robbie was part of Airwave, Bruce was part of Airwave. Who else on that team was part of it? And anyway, that's how it was born. It was a wet, windy, typical British nationals competition of the 90s. I don't think we did a huge amount of flying. Most of us were down the pub, and these guys were gathered together, and then Ozone was born. And they're very kind to me. I've been flying Ozone equipment since about 2000 or so.
The reason why I got curious is because a lot of brands have come and gone over the period of time, but they seem to have done a lot of things right and solidified their positions as time passed, be it picking the people they're collaborating with or bringing out new technologies or, investing in the R&D. So that is what makes me curious about Ozone, that how did a legacy brand, which was pioneering at the time of its inception, play its card right and stay true to the competition and still win where it mattered the most?
They all love it. It's true of all the other manufacturers too. They're just a great team, I assume. Huge skills. And I know that I think it's their own factory, isn't it, that David Pilkington runs in Vietnam. And I think that they also manufacture other people's. They've obviously got a great business model and a great team. I know that Mike Kavanagh is probably a super manager, and clearly he's got his fingers on the buttons in terms of the numbers, making sure that it's financially viable as well. But the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? They have maintained a very good market lead for quite a long time now. They've also created some huge technological advantages like the shark's nose. I think they might have been the first to do all the diagonal ribs. I can't remember all the advantages they've made, but consistently their wings are great to fly. And they fit my weight range well, which is handy. Well, they don't on their lightweight wings. So I'm always having to fly one of the full weight wings.
Fair enough, Eddie. Thank you for your politically correct answer, which is very well thought of.
Yeah.
Love your neutral, unbiased stance on such a question.
The proof is in the pudding. They've maintained their market lead. If you look at the comps, despite the huge efforts and abilities of Nivea and Jin and other manufacturers, Ozone, Nivea and Jin seem to, with Ozone noticeably in the lead in terms of the top scorers. They've tended to be Ozone over the years.
Fair enough. Eddie, before we wrap up, as from probably last time, there's a tradition where you share one amazing flight from your life, but the reason I'm asking you this is that you have been kind enough to share the Bada Bengal flight to our audiences last time around as well.
Yeah.
But anything else, something new for our audiences this time around?
Yes. Okay. I've got loads of epic, memorable flights, and it's hard to choose one because there have been loads of them. But earlier you were asking me about John and what gave him the edge and stuff. I'd like to share two in a way, but I'll try and do one where John flew down the Chogo Longma Glacier, which is like, again, I'm doing this from memory, so I may be wrong on my numbers. From the Golden Peak or Spantic, they're both the same peak, and they're amazing 7,000. Oh, God knows how big it is. 7,600 meters or over 7,000 meters tall. It's massive. And it's got these amazing bedding planes, vertical bedding planes, and snow all over it. And it's got this col, which is a bit lower, but still well over 7, I think. And it's near the Hispar and the Baltoro Glacier, which are the biggest ice fields which aren't on the poles. This big terrain. And John talked about this flight, and he said he's going to go over Spantic. And gosh, yeah, there's so many flights where John pushed it just a bit further than me. It's bringing up a memory of another one. And yeah, and anyway, we took off to do this flight. And I was climbing, well, John was doing his normal thing where I was high and John was low. I was up there at 7,000 meters or something, and John was lower, following this spine up to the Spantic. He was probably only at 5,500 meters. I was well above him. He was looking, I was finding it very hard to see him, but I was trailing him from above. And I got to the top of Spantic, and I just looked, and there was just snow everywhere, not a valley system in sight that would have a road system, track, or jeep system on it. And I carried on a different way. I went down into the Hispar Glacier, where you can see K2 from there. But John didn't. I just saw this little glider go over the back of Spantic and carry on. And I did this lovely little loop, ran into the glacier, and landed at the foot of the glacier in this tiny place called Hispar. I had this epic hitch out of Hispar on a tractor across scree slopes, moving scree. That was really terrifying, but exciting. I got back to Karimnabad and then heard John's story about how he managed to milk his way down this glacier, a lot of it only 50 meters above the ground, above the ice rather than the ground. And
50 meters.
Yeah, 50 meters. He was getting one little climb after the next little climb after the next. Managed to persevere and get down pretty close to Skardu, close enough to easily get a vehicle to Skardu. I was pleased that I hadn't done that flight, quite honestly, because I know that I would have shitted. Sorry, I would have been really scared. If I'd ever landed out there, I would have found it very hard to walk out from. So I'm quite happy John took it, but I'm quite happy to give it in the sense that to not try and take it myself. I think that was a shrewd move. I might not have survived the journey. But then it tells me just because I want to big myself up a little bit rather than just constantly bigging up John. No, but I want to reassure you. I did another flight on that same trip where I flew about 100K westward, of which at all times I could vaguely see a jeep track. I always knew the instructor, and I taught so many people to always know that you had a way out. And up there is me not being a massive mountain man, not knowing how to negotiate a glacier, how to negotiate crevasses. I do know a bit about this sort of thing nowadays, but back then I didn't know anything. But having enough respect and fear of the terrain not to want to risk landing in it, I was high enough up to do that trip. And then I flew back. Flying back was amazing because I was in orbit all the time over 6,000 meters and some of it over 7,000. And it seemed to get better as the day got on. And I think 7,000 meters, I was up there. And the day was coming to a close. I realized this, and my caution of not wanting to land out in unfamiliar territory in this kind of big terrain. I was keen to make goal, keen to get back to Karimnabad in this instance. In a known landing field, there was this lovely sort of beach you could land at beside the river. I was milking out the length of the day. It was just so funny because elementary kind of mistake, and it was all the eagerness. And the valleys are so steep there, and the sun and the mountains are so tall that and your elevation is so great that it's bright sunlight up there. But as I got into the valley, and as I looked down as well, I could see the valleys were falling into shadow, and all faces, even the west faces, were falling into shadow. And it was like, okay, so yeah, the day's dragging on. But then maybe I was a bit hypoxic, but it suddenly the obvious thing clicked. It was like, shit. It's actually getting dark down there. I'm in sunlight because I'm so bloody high up. And by then, there weren't the good landing options particularly. So I had to just blat it towards this known landing area at that height. So I did. I blatted it as fast as I could to get there. And I didn't quite make it. I had to do one of the most dangerous landings of my life, but perfectly. But anyway, so that was a 200K out and return landing in the dark in 2001, I think.
Geez, Eddie, you seem to have lived a life full of adventure worth sharing. I believe
that landing, I just want to say about that landing, it was extraordinary. I landed on the top of the gully. There was a gully, and just half a K, there was the beach. There was a danger I wasn't going to make the beach and I was going to end up in the gully. So I had to put it in on the top of the gully. There was a sort of zero wind landing on the top of the gully and the sort of 4-meter wide area, and then a stone wall. I didn't have the height to clear the stone wall. So I had to land on the 4-meter wide area and grab the stone wall, and the wing fell behind me and fell into the gully. And it was only a foot or two down, but the gully was made in moraine, glacial moraine, so it was lots of loose rock just stacked on top of each other. I was concerned that a rock could fall off the edge of the cliff onto the wing and pull me over. It was memorable.
Memorable, exciting, scary, all in one go.
Yeah.
I wish this was a video podcast, man. I really need to get my game up, because the way you were explaining the last few were quite interesting to see, and I'm not sure if our audiences can visualize this in the audio only format, but yeah.
Despite my red face.
Yes, just for your info, if you're wondering, Eddie seems to be a bit more red than white from what I usually know him of, and I don't know why UK is not having
an Indian, which means red Eddie.
Indeed. So Eddie Lal is the avatar that we got you this time around on Paragliding Atlas. Before we wrap up, I believe you are planning to share these stories and more awesomeness, your followers, in a tour. Would you like to speak about that before we close?
Yeah, I do talks occasionally. I'm just doing a talk locally because I've been asked to for 30 years of paragliding, and I hope this is convenient. This is great. This is part of hopefully bringing that on board. It's a training session partly for me to share this first with you. That talk will have slides and things. The other thing I wanted to share is the one thing about being problematic, apart from the crowding, is the mountain rescue facilities. And despite the massive efforts of the local people, there are good ground crews that would get people out of trees from all sorts of extraordinary places, and they'll walk through the night to try and get to pilots in trouble and carry them down. There are brave and able helicopter pilots, but there's no dedicated helicopter rescue system. And the helicopter pilots aren't necessarily there. They're quite often a long flight away and can't get there the same day. And sometimes they can't get there for 2 or 3 days. So we are exploring the idea of tandem rescue. And if anyone thinks they may be able to help me in that, we're developing a stretcher, and we're seeking insurance so that me and other extremely qualified and able pilots can assist people in the Beer area by doing some of the rescues by tandem, the ones that we can get to. And the incidents do generally occur top landing. So we hope that we could get to many of them, because if people are trying to top land, it's theoretically possible, and hopefully we will be able to assist. It's pioneering again. We're pioneering a new field, and that field is the field of rescue. And so if anyone out there has the professional skills, contacts within the insurance industry, if anyone feels they're able to assist in that, please feel free to send me a message. It'd be great to hear from you.
Indeed, Eddie, and the more the merrier in such a good cause, I would say. So what we're going to do is we're going to put out all your details along with the YouTube videos and your contact information in the show notes. So what I hope is that if there's anybody in the audience is from wherever part of the world you're joining us, in 75 countries and counting, it's quite a diverse and wide audience base that we have spread. If there's any way you can contribute to this cause, please, now is the time, because you're not only making the sport a better and safer place for yourself, but also for everybody else in the community. And people like Eddie, time and again, remind us that creating shared value is the way to go. And if we can be a part of the bandwagon, then there's nothing more rewarding and more fulfilling in life, I would say.
Thank you, Ananda. That's very kind of you.
On that note, Eddie, it's very kind of you to come back on the show and share unfiltered and honest versions of your experiences. And all I can say is, until next time, it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure.
Thanks, man. Great.